Welcome to the 8th Annual Conference of the Weston A. Price Foundation. We are delighted to see you here. And the subject of our seminar today is Nourishing Traditional Diets, the Key to Vibrant Health. The burning question that we are asking ourselves and seeking the answer for, what is a healthy diet? And I'm sure that you're all as confused as the general population about what a healthy diet is. I think everyone has a fairly general idea that how we eat has something to do with how healthy we are. But there's so many conflicting claims about what constitutes a healthy diet. Is it the Atkins diet, based largely on animal foods? Is it a vegetarian or vegan diet that avoids animal foods? And then all of these other dietary schemes for which many claims are made, the zone diet, the macrobiotic diet, the South Beach diet. How can we make sense of all of these conflicting claims? Even Lisa Simpson, who's a very smart young lady, even Lisa Simpson is confused. And then, of course, we have the U.S. government official diet. With the food pyramid and resulting in all these pyramidal-shaped people. And believe me, the rationale for this diet is not to make you healthy. It is to promote the products of commodity agriculture, because that's what the U.S. Department of Agriculture is set up to do, is promote commodity agriculture. In order to answer this question, what is a healthy diet, we turn to the pioneer of nutrition research, Dr. Weston Price. Dr. Price was a dentist, actually. His practice was in Cleveland, Ohio. He was a very successful dentist for his day. And he had a lot of patients who asked him, what is a healthy diet? How can I be healthier? And Dr. Price did not know the answer to this question. What he did know is that he was seeing increasing levels of disease among his patients. Dental caries, cavities, infection in the mouth, and also what he referred to as dental deformities. We have a different way of saying that. We say crooked teeth, crowded teeth. But he was seeing all sorts of problems in the development of the jaw and the teeth. And what he noticed and what he observed was that people who had poor dental health, people who had cavities, who had infection, people who had crowded and crooked teeth and overbites, generally had poor overall health. The teeth were a mirror to the rest of the body. And he was concerned because it seemed like the health of the American population was deteriorating and getting worse and worse, at least based on what he was seeing in his practice. Now, this was a time back in the 30s, and actually this was the early 20s when he started his practice, when the world was opening up. There were sections of the globe that had been discovered and isolated populations described and photographed. And one of the most common observations that Westerners had when they discovered these isolated people was what beautiful teeth they had. Even the first settlers to America described in their diaries the Native Americans as having teeth broad and straight and white as piano keys. And this intrigued Dr. Price very much because this is not what he was seeing in his practice. He was seeing decay. He was seeing blackened, crooked, unattractive teeth. Well, Dr. Price decided that he was going to see for himself whether these reports were true. And so he embarked on a series of investigations that took him 10 years to complete and took him to many isolated parts of the globe in order to answer two questions. The first question was it true? Was it true that isolated people living far from all the so-called benefits of civilization had excellent dental health? They did not suffer from cavities. They did not have dental deformities. And by inference, if they had good dental health, good overall health. The second question was, if he could find these healthy populations, what were they eating? What was a the type of diet that supported this kind of health. He was not interested in what unhealthy people were eating. He knew what unhealthy people were eating. He knew what his patients were eating. But he didn't know what to tell them to eat to be healthy. So that was the genius of Dr. Price. He asked the right questions, and then he very systematically went about answering those questions. The first place that Dr. Price went was an isolated valley in Switzerland. Switzerland at this time in the early 1930s had embarked on a road building project to connect all the villages and all the towns in Switzerland. But he found a few villages that were still not connected to the road. This particular village was in the Lowenschel Valley. This village was at the end of a valley surrounded by very steep mountain ranges. And the only access to this village was a footpath too narrow for a wheeled cart. That way he was assured that the foods that they were eating, they grew there in the village for themselves, with the exception of salt, which was carried in. They did not have salt. Now, when he came to a tribe or a village, the way he worked was he sat down with the elders and with the help of an interpreter, he explained his research. And when he had their permission, he then took every individual from the village, young and old, sick, no exceptions. He wasn't leaving out people deliberately. And he lined them all up, and then he very carefully looked in every single mouth and meticulously counted cavities. And that part of his research, he kept little notebooks. It was very precise and scientific. He also noted the presence of dental deformities. And this part of his research was published in peer-reviewed journals of his day. He also took general notes about the health of the population based on his observations. And then he made notes about the food. He described the foods that they were eating. And he took samples of the foods back to his laboratory in Cleveland and analyzed them for nutrient content. So this was the way that Dr. Price worked. It was actually a very scientific way of working to answer these two specific questions that he had. Well, you can imagine the amazement of the dentist from Cleveland, Ohio, coming to this isolated village in Switzerland and lining up, first of all the children. And he had to look in 3 mouths before he found even one tooth that had evidence of decay. So there was less than 1% tooth decay among the children in the Swiss village. And every child, every individual in the village had naturally straight teeth. No one needed braces. There were no dental deformities. He described the children's faces as broad. Their nostrils were broad, had very good facial construction. They were also very sturdy. They played barefooted in the freezing water of the running streams during weather in which he and his wife had to wear heavy overcoats. The Price Pottinger Nutrition Foundation has just released another photograph from Switzerland, and you can see how round the children's faces are. Very good facial development, allowing plenty of space in the jaw for the teeth to come in straight. By the way, the children did not brush their teeth. They didn't have toothpaste, they didn't have fluoride treatments. In fact, he very delicately described their teeth as being covered with green slime, but they were not decayed. He also, of course, looked at the adults, and he found the same situation in the adults. Virtually no tooth decay and no dental deformities, very straight teeth. The men in the village were known for their great strength. They routinely won the athletic contests held throughout Switzerland, and the women were known for their great beauty from this particular village. When he talked to the health officials in Switzerland, he learned from them that there had never been a case of tuberculosis in these few isolated Swiss villages. And this was a time when tuberculosis was a huge problem in the rest of Switzerland. It was the #1 killer, not only in Switzerland, but throughout Europe. But these people seem to be completely immune to tuberculosis. So here we are in the Swiss village, the first place that he visited, with his first question, could he find a healthy population? And he has answered this question with a yes. He's found a population with excellent dental health, from all he can determine, excellent overall health. So we go now to the next question. What were these people eating? The #1 source of calories in the Swiss village was the very food accused of causing tuberculosis in the rest of the world. It was raw milk. These people kept cattle and goats grazed on the lush green pasture beneath the melting glaciers. And the chief source of calories in the diet was raw milk, and then raw cheese, raw butter, and raw cream. And the other major source of calories was a special type of bread. They grew rye in the short summer season, and they made a very dense sourdough rye bread. And that was the source of calories. It was basically rye bread and raw milk. And I find this very interesting because one of the theories that we have out there about why we have so many health problems today is because we're eating these two foods that are new to the human diet, dairy foods and grains. There are a number of writers who say to be healthy, you need to avoid dairy foods and grains. And yet here was a supremely healthy population whose main source of calories was dairy foods and grains. But the dairy foods they were consuming were very different from the dairy foods that we buy today in the supermarket, and the grains were prepared in a much different way than we prepare our grains today. We'll talk about both of these later on in the seminar. They also did eat meat, usually once a week, usually veal. They ate the whole animal, including the organ meats. The bones were used to make soup. And they grew vegetables in their gardens during the summer and had a few vegetables in the warmer months. But basically, this was a diet based on dairy foods and grains. A typical lunch for the children going to school would be a very thick slice of the dense sourdough rye bread and an equally thick slice of the beautiful raw Swiss cheese. Every culture that he went to had one or more sacred foods. The sacred foods were considered very important for pregnant women, nursing mothers, and growing children. These cultures seem to recognize in a way that we have forgotten that nutrition is absolutely vital during that period when the baby is being formed and growing, when the body is being formed. You can't go back in later years and form a perfect body. And the very nutrient-dense food needs to be supplied during that growth period. The sacred food for the Swiss villagers was a very special type of butter. It was the butter that came from the cows when they first went to pasture in the spring. This butter was a deep orange color. And so much did they honor this butter that they had a special ceremony in their churches where they lit a bowl of the butter. They had a wick in the bowl of butter on the altar in their churches to honor the life-giving force in the butter. That was this very special ceremony for the first butter in the spring. Here's a picture of their bread. This is a festival loaf, a very large loaf of bread. It will probably weigh 15 or 20 pounds. Very dense bread. It takes a couple of days to make this bread. There's no yeast used. It's a sourdough method that's a type of fermentation. We'll come back to this subject later on. They put a hole in the bread so they can hang it up on a hook, and it actually is allowed to cure for 2 weeks before they eat the bread. So there's a very long and careful preparation of the grains, a common theme in traditional cultures. Notice the wonderful bone structure of the woman, especially this part of the face. The middle third of the face, she has very broad cheekbones. That's what gives beauty to the human face. She's nice and slender in spite of her high-fat diet. And what I like best about this photograph is the hat. The splendid health and physical attractiveness and resistance to disease that he found among the so-called primitive Swiss villagers was in stark contrast to what he found in the villages connected to the outside world by a road. As soon as the roads came to the village, stores were opened, and the stores carried what he called the displacing foods of modern commerce. These are foods based on sugar, white flour, canned foods, canned condensed milk, chocolates, candies, jams, jellies, pastries, and so forth. When the roads came to the village, the first thing that happened was that people began to suffer from tooth decay. In these villages with roads, he found that 1 tooth in 3 was decayed. And you can imagine the suffering that this caused because the foods causing the decay had arrived in these villages, but it took a while for the dentist to get there. But what concerned him the most was the children who were born after the road came to the village. As soon as the food shops opened up and people started eating these foods, the children born after that time had dental deformities. Their faces were more narrow, their jaws did not have room for the teeth to come in straight. So you started to see crooked teeth, crowded mouths, overbites, and underbites. And the other thing that occurred as soon as the roads came was tuberculosis. The scourge of civilization, it just became a huge problem when people began to eat the processed, refined foods. The next place that Dr. Price went, and he only looked at two Caucasian or European cultures. One was the Swiss culture, and the other were the Gaelic people living on a very windswept island off the coast of Scotland in the Outer Hebrides. Here he once again found a high degree of physical perfection, virtually no cavities, good facial development. Now the Gaelic face will be more narrow genetically than the Alpine face. Nevertheless, there was plenty of room for the teeth to come in straight. He was also struck by the outlook of these people. They had a wonderful spiritual view of life. They were very cheerful and optimistic, living on this grim, windswept island with no television, no casinos, no video games. Now, these people had a very different diet from the Swiss villagers. They lived on an island that was very rocky. They had no animals there, so they had no meat in their diet, no eggs, no dairy foods. They couldn't grow fruits and vegetables there, so no fruits, no vegetables. What in the world were these people eating? Well, their diet was based on seafood of every imaginable type, various types of fish, shellfish, oysters, clams, and they ate the heads of the fish, the organ meats of the fish. The one green food they had was seaweed. And they also were able to grow oats on the island, so they had porridge and oat cakes. So this was a diet based on seafood and oats. The sacred food, the food that growing children got every morning for breakfast so they'd grow up healthy and strong, was cod's head stuffed with oats and chopped cod's liver. The soil on the island was very poor, and so they had to put a type of fertilizer on the soil, and the fertilizer was the thatch from their cottages. They lived in these cottages that had no chimneys, and during the winter the thatch would become black with the smoke, and they would re-thatch in the spring and take all of that blackened thatch and put it on the fields, and that was how they got a mature crop of oats. Dr. Price actually took some of the island soil home with him and planted oats in it. These are oats planted in the soil with no amendment. These are various types of commercial fertilizers added to the soil, and the only pot that gave him a mature crop of oats was this island soil that had the thatch added to it. So they very much understood the principle of soil fertility and the need to add nutrients to the soil to get good growth there. Now, in some of the islands that Dr. Price went to where they had trading posts there and people were starting to eat food from the outside, tuberculosis became a huge problem. And the health workers told them that they were getting tuberculosis because they lived in these smoke-filled cottages all winter long. And these were very smoky cottages, breathing in this smoke all winter. So they had everyone put chimneys in. This did not solve the tuberculosis problem. They still had tuberculosis. But no one stopped to ask why these isolated islanders living in these smoke-filled cottages did not get tuberculosis. It was because their diets were so rich in nutrients that they were protected even from the stress of breathing in smoke all day long, all day and all night long. We'll come back to this subject of smoke because smoke is full of dioxins. And dioxins are not something that's new to the human environment. We have actually had more exposure to dioxins in the past when we used fires for warmth and to cook our food. And the body actually has a mechanism to deal with dioxins, which we'll talk about. Dr. Price then went to Alaska. He went out into the isolated villages away from the coastline so he could study the islander or the Alaskans who were living as their ancestors lived. Here he found a very high degree of physical perfection, beautiful broad faces, naturally straight teeth, very strong, sturdy babies. He noted that the babies were curious, they were alert, and they never cried. This was an observation he made in these cultures. He did not hear crying babies in cultures where the people were well nourished. When babies cry, it means they're hungry. It means they're hungry for nutrients, that something in them is not being satisfied, is not being fed. He found virtually no cavities among these people. And in speaking to a doctor who had lived with the Eskimos for 30 years, he learned that there had never been observed by this doctor a case of cancer, heart disease, tuberculosis, or any condition requiring an operation among those who ate their ancestral foods. Among the Eskimos who were eating the displacing foods of modern commerce, he found all of the diseases of the Western world. Here is another page from his book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. He calls these primitive Eskimos, and when he uses the word primitive, he's using it as a compliment. This is the amazing thing about Dr. Price. He was in awe of the wisdom that they exercised in choosing their foods, and he believed that we had a lot to learn from the traditional people. This was in sharp contrast to the attitude of most Westerners, who believed that we had nothing to learn from these people, that it was all one way. We were bringing civilization to all of these primitive places, and that we had nothing to learn from them. Dr. Price's view was just the opposite. He believed, and he wrote in his book, that if we do not learn from these people the secrets of how to have a healthy diet, we would actually die out as a civilization. Now, many of the Eskimos had worn down teeth or even missing teeth because they chewed on leather to make their clothes and encountered grit and grains of sand. But even the worn down teeth were not decayed. There was virtually no tooth decay among the primitive Eskimos, and as you can see, very good development of the face and the dental palate. The contrast with what he found in the villages where there were trading posts and food coming in was tragic. Tremendous tooth decay. You can imagine the suffering this caused, and this once very happy, optimistic people became prone to suicide. And the only reason given for suicide was the pain of tooth decay. They developed all of our diseases, and then in the next generation, the generation who was born after they started eating the Western foods, they had changes in the facial structure. They had more narrow faces and dental deformities, overbites, underbites. And he noted that the children coming along with these dental deformities had more health problems. They were much more prone to both chronic and infectious disease. Well, let's go back a minute and look at the foods of the healthy Eskimos. What were these people eating? And here we have a very different diet once again. The main source of calories in the Eskimo diet was seal oil, an animal fat. They're carrying it here actually in the stomach of the animal. They've made a bag of the stomach, and that is seal oil. And the seal oil was used for cooking, for food preservation. They preserved foods in the seal oil. It was used for a dressing on their foods. They had a special kind of Eskimo icing where they beat the seal oil till it was frothy, and then added a few berries or a few fish eggs for fish egg ice cream, and that was and that was for special occasions like birthdays. Naturally, the Eskimos ate a lot of fish, and many times the fish were prepared by a process of fermentation. They were actually thrown into a hole and allowed to ferment for maybe several weeks until it became soft and sort of like soft cheese, actually. And they also ate lots of game. They had one food combining rule, which was that they never ate lean meat. When they killed a marine animal or a land mammal, they first of all ate the fatty organ meats. They took all the lean meat and cut it in strips and dried it or smoked it, and they saved all of the fat from the animal. The inside fat, the cavity fat, the fat along the back, and that was rendered and saved, and when they ate the lean meat, they spread it with the fat. They even cut the liver into strips and dried and smoked the liver and spread the liver with the fat. So they never ate lean meat. This is a food combining rule that you find all over the world among so-called primitive peoples. Going back to the fish, again, the fermented fish. The reason that they ate fermented fish is that they noticed when they fed their dogs fresh fish, the dogs could not pull the sleds all day long. But if they fed fermented fish to the dogs had the stamina to pull the sleds all day long. So these people were very observant of what animals did, and they figured if this was good for the dogs, it was good for humans. And so they ate the fermented fish to give them strength and stamina. And we'll look into this later on today about why it is that fermented foods do give us so much strength and stamina. The sacred food among the Eskimos was salmon eggs. They had put the salmon eggs in the sun to dry so they would have them throughout the year. And when he asked them why they went to such trouble to preserve these salmon eggs, they said to him, "We need these salmon eggs to have healthy babies." So that was their sacred food. No fish was ever eaten without also eating the roe or the eggs in the fish. Dr. Price spent quite a bit of time with Native Americans. Now, these are not his photographs. These are some famous photographs of Native Americans. They were strikingly handsome people before they came in contact with the West, with beautiful facial structure. This is a Navajo. And the first people in the New World were in awe of the magnificent body structure of the Native Americans. The Indians in Texas, for example, were described as on average over 7 feet tall. They never wore clothes, not even in the cold weather. When the ice formed on the ponds, it was a lot of fun for them to get up in the morning and break the ice and go swimming in the ponds. You know, the Indians did not have horses before the white man came, and they hunted on foot. And so swift were they, and they had so much stamina that they were able to outrun deer and buffalo. They hunted on foot. What a change there has been with several generations of Western foods. These are photographs of Dr. Price taken in northern Canada. These were some isolated Native Americans. He found no tooth decay, no dental deformities, very good facial structure, no signs of any disease. And they lived mostly off game animals like the moose and the elk. And once again, they had this food combining rule. They never ate lean meat. They hunted animals during the season when they were the fattest, and they hunted the older animals because the older animals had more fat on them. The contrast between the modernized Native Americans was once again tragic. Those living on the reservation suffered from tremendous tooth decay, and then the next generation had the altered facial structure. Not enough room in the jaw for the teeth to come in straight. These are Seminole Indians in the Florida Everglades, and they were very shy, and it took them about 2 weeks to grant permission for the photographs. Dr. Price had to sit around and twiddle his thumbs for a couple of weeks while the elders debated this, and we're so glad that they did give permission, because you can see from these photographs what splendid, magnificent people they were. There was just nobility in every face in these Native Americans fed on traditional foods, traditional nutrient-dense foods. You can see the very good facial construction, naturally straight teeth in every member of the tribe, and no tooth decay. When you see facial structure like this, what you're seeing is the full expression of the genetic potential. We all have a blueprint for our bodies, and that blueprint is the genetics. And the genetics of every one of us is to have a strong, sturdy, and attractive body with naturally straight teeth. That is your genetic blueprint. Whether or not the body is built according to that blueprint depends on the building materials, and the building materials are the foods. So if you want to think that the genetics comes from the Creator, our health is actually a partnership with the Creator. The genetics are given to us But our job is to make sure that the growing child has the right building materials, the right types of foods. And the teeth tell the tale. When we see a person with the good bone structure and the well-formed jaw and straight teeth, that means that everything has been properly constructed in the body. It means that there'll be plenty of room in the head for the very important organs there, the pituitary, pineal, and hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, by the way, is the seat of impulse control. So there'll be a lot of willpower in people who have this good facial construction. Whereas if you see the crowded teeth, it's a sign that there's going to be some compromise in the head for all of these master glands. If the teeth are straight and well constructed, that means all of the muscles and tendons will be developed to their optimal potential. Whereas someone with crooked and crowded teeth will likely have poor development, poor posture, and will be easily injured. The native people had very keen eyesight and hearing. One of the first things that goes when we start eating processed foods is that keen eyesight and hearing, and suddenly everyone needs corrective lenses. You'll see the optimal function of all of the organs, the lungs, the kidneys, the liver, whereas there might be compromised function when you have the compromised dental development. People who are raised on nutrient-dense diets and have the good skeletal development tend to have an optimistic outlook on life. They learn easily, whereas once you start getting this compromise in the development of the body, the brain is an organ as well, and you start seeing things like depression, behavior problems, and learning disabilities. And finally, when you see that beautiful round face and the nice straight teeth, that means that the pelvic opening is round and childbirth is easy and painless. When you have the more narrow face, then the pelvic opening becomes oval or elliptical, and childbirth becomes painful and very difficult. Now let's compare our beautiful Seminole Indian princess here, brought up on traditional foods, which would include fish, game, reptiles, plenty of fat, of course, in the diet, lots of organ meats, with someone from her same tribe who was born after the parents changed their diet. This is the same genetics, it's the same blueprint for the body, but different building materials. She has crowded teeth. That's a sign that there's going to be a compromise in the entire body and the way that it was built. And this is not a hereditary problem. The genetics have not changed here. This is a nutritional problem. This is a problem with the building materials. You don't have the strength of materials in this body to have the nice wide facial structure. Dr. Price then went to the South Seas. He made a point of going to islands where there was very little contact with the outside world. And this is my favorite page from his book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. Look at these beautiful smiles. You know, Dr. Price is accused of being unscientific, of, he's outdated. Well, we've learned a lot since then, and it's not healthy to eat the kind of diet that he recommends. And we hear a lot of things like that about Dr. Price. But when you look at these pictures, you realize that we don't see this type of facial structure anymore. He's captured something very valuable for us, what healthy people look like. And these are teenage boys. I want to point out, our teenage boys don't look like this, do they? They don't look this happy and optimistic. These are women from the island. He noted that all the men look like brothers and all the women look like sisters, even if they were not related. That cuts down on the jealousy factor in these cultures. And this beautiful lady here is 90 years old. When you have that excellent facial structure and the good diet throughout life, you age very gracefully. We will never know the average lifespan of these people because records were not kept. And certainly there was a lot of trauma in their life. Their lives were dangerous. People were injured and died in that way. But nevertheless, there were plenty of elderly people who had very important roles in these societies. So what's this diet like? What is the diet of the South Seas like? And it's a much more interesting diet. We're in the tropics now. There's plenty of fruits and vegetables in the diet, lots of plant foods. There's coconut, which is actually a type of fruit, a very oily fruit. They had the taro root, so they had a lot of carbohydrates in the diet that we haven't seen before. Interestingly enough, the taro root was prepared by fermentation. They dug a hole and threw in the taro roots and let them ferment for 2 weeks, just like the bread was allowed to be cured for 2 weeks. Nevertheless, the basis of the diet was animal foods, especially foods from the sea. We see the octopus, the crab, shellfish, any type of fish. Shark was a very important food in the diet. And when they had caught a fish or shellfish, they ate the whole animal. They ate the eggs, they ate the organ meats. There's a kind of yellow goop inside that crab, which is extremely nutritious. That was eaten. Then they took the shell and ground up the shell and added it to some other foods for calcium. They had pigs on the island. The pigs were roasted in underground ovens, and they ate the whole animal, including the organ meats, the skin, the bones, and the fat. And this young man with his wonderful facial structure is having a snack, which he did not get from a vending machine. He's eating a delicious fatty sea worm. The sacred food among these islanders was the shark liver. They went to considerable risk to catch the shark. They didn't need shark. They had plenty of food. But they went on these very dangerous shark hunting expeditions because to get these nutrient-dense parts of the shark. The men ate the male organs of the shark, and the women ate the female organs of the shark. So you also find in many of these cultures there's specific foods for men and women. These islands where they were on their traditional foods were like a paradise. We've had many writers talk about this. Herman Melville went and lived among these islanders. Gauguin went back and lived among the islanders. The people were cheerful and pleasant and beautiful. When they switched to the Western diet, this is what happened. The tremendous tooth decay, and then in the next generation, the altered facial structure, the narrowing of the face. And the other thing that's disappeared is that beautiful, optimistic smile. This is what modern young people look like today. Very often they have an expression on their face as if they feel like they've been cheated. They might not be able to put it into words, but there's a sense that they've been had. And they have been cheated. They've been cheated of their birthright of physical perfection, which is the birthright of every human being born onto this planet. Whether that birthright is achieved is the duty and the responsibility of the people who've come before them. These photographs were taken in a tuberculosis ward in Hawaii. Every single child in the ward had dental deformities. Now, the dental deformities were not the cause of their tuberculosis. The same conditions that prevented the optimal expression of their genetics also made them very susceptible to these diseases. Dr. Price went to Australia. Very high degree of physical perfection, very keen eyesight and hearing, very strong limber people living on traditional foods. This was a fascinating diet with lots of variety. They had legumes and grains which were prepared with great care. Usually the legumes and grains were put in baskets in running water for 2 weeks before they were then roasted and prepared into food. The basis of the diet was animal foods, birds, fish, sea mammals, kangaroo, game animals, and they also valued an insect called the witchetty grub, which was about 6 inches long and very full of fat. Once again, they were looking for the fat in their animal foods. These are Aboriginal women. They've never been to the dentist. They've never used a toothbrush, and yet their teeth are so perfect. They look like false teeth. And you can see the contrast between an Aboriginal woman on traditional foods and those who've gone into the towns and started eating the so-called civilized diet. The tooth decay, and then the next generation, the altered facial structure. Dr. Price referred to this as the underdevelopment of the middle third of the face. This is the first part of the body that's affected by the change in diet. Dr. Price went to Africa. He went into the interior of Africa and to places where few white men had been before, and he could not get over what he found in Africa. In Africa, he found 7 tribes with 100 or more people in every tribe, and not a single cavity. Over 700 individuals and no cavities. He found no dental deformities, no signs of any disease, including the diseases that we associate with Africa. As long as they were on their traditional diet, they were completely immune to the ravages of the displacing diet of modern commerce. Now, his African experience allowed him to compare 3 diets practiced by the same racial group. The first were the herders, the people who kept cattle and goats. They had a diet that was almost exclusively animal food. Their diet consisted of milk, meat, and blood. It was a very high-fat diet. The warriors drank up to 1.5 gallons of raw milk, usually fermented raw milk every day, and that gave them the equivalent of 3 sticks of butter a day, 3/4 pound of butter per day. These people were very slender and had no signs of heart disease and very low cholesterol. The second group were the hunter-gatherers. They did not keep animals, but they hunted and fished. They also ate a variety of plant foods, and they had a sacred food, which was liver, which was eaten both raw and cooked. The third group were the agriculturalists. They did not keep animals, they did not hunt, but they grew corn, beans, and squash. They were not vegans, however, because about 10% of their diet was insects, especially termites. It was a very important food in their diet. So when he compared these 3 groups, the first 2, the ones with a lot of animal foods in the diet, had no cavities. The agriculturalists had about 6% tooth decay. Now, this was a completely natural diet, but very lean on the animal foods, and they did suffer from tooth decay. They also tended to be shorter, a little bit overweight, and not as robust as the hunter-gatherers or the people who kept flocks of cattle and goats. Comparing the first 2 groups, as I said, neither of these groups suffered from tooth decay, but the group that had the mixed diet, the hunter-gatherers who had both animal and plant foods, they were not as tall, but they were much stronger and had better proportions. So one of the lessons of his African experience was that the ideal diet avoids the extreme, not too much animal food and not too much plant food, somewhere in the middle, a balance between animal and plant foods. Here's a Maasai warrior. These are the milk-drinking people. They tended to be very tall and slender. But no matter which diet they started out on, none of these groups was immune to the ravages of these displacing foods. When they came in contact with the West and started imitating the white man and eating his foods, this is what happened. Tremendous tooth decay. The difference is that they didn't have dentists. We have dentists to repair the damage. We have doctors to repair the damage. And we want to be very grateful for these miracles of modern dentistry and modern medicine. But there's only so much that the dentists and the doctors can repair. And we've actually come to the point in our civilization, especially with this next generation, where there's just not much that the medical profession can do. And then the next generation, he saw this same pattern in every race that he studied, everywhere in the world that he went. The children born to parents who had begun eating Western foods had the change in facial structure, the narrowing of the face, the underdevelopment of the middle third of the face, and they were much more susceptible to the modern diseases. This photograph perfectly illustrates the difference between a face that's constructed with good building materials. This is good facial development. You can see there's a very broad, strong palate. This part of the face is very well developed. Whereas this face is a typical modern face. There's not as much strength in the cheekbones and the dental palate, so it has to be more narrow. It almost looks as though this face is hanging from the skull. And that's adaptation that the body makes. In order to survive, the body just becomes constructed more narrowly when the building materials are not good. So here we can see this difference in these dental casts made by Dr. Price. This is the cast of a primitive person, and this is a modern adult. Here you see in the front view. And I've put some architectural drawings here just to make to carry this analogy one step further. You cannot build a strong, wide arch unless you have very strong building materials. So what you see here is beauty, strength, and order. And what you see here is weakness, chaos, what Dr. Price referred to as physical degeneration. There was a doctor named Pottinger who did a study with cats over a number of years, over get back to work in making this a perfect planet. Dr. Price said, individual beauty is a matter of both design of the face and regularity and perfection of the teeth. Nature always builds harmoniously if conditions are sufficiently favorable, regardless of race, color, or location. So nature doesn't make mistakes. It's people make mistakes, and of course that's a learning process. But nature does not make mistakes. Well, by now you're probably completely confused because I said that I was going to answer this question, what is a healthy diet? And yet all of these diets were different. And a lot of people reading Dr. Price throw up their hands and say, well, all these diets were different, so there's no such thing as a healthy diet. That is the wrong conclusion to reach from Dr. Price. We see that some had lots of animal foods, some had fairly few animal foods, some had mostly cooked foods, some had mostly raw foods, some had dairy foods and some didn't, some had grains and some didn't. So how are we going to make sense out of all of these different diets and come to some kind of guidelines for ourselves? That's what we're going to do. Next, we're going to look at 11 underlying characteristics of healthy diets. Once you understand these principles, you then can take these principles and apply them to your own family, to your budget, to what's available to you, and most importantly, to what your family will actually eat. Because there's no sense trying to impose on other people foods that they don't like.